Talk about the gut microbiome, which is 100 trillion potential bacteria in our large intestine. There are 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. There is not just one microbiome. There are many microbiomes. It's dependent on how you are raised, what foods you eat, how much hygiene you practice versus allowing yourself to get exposed to nature and dirt. It's a very complex issue. You know, the gut health is tied to every single chronic disease on the planet. 11% of the world population suffers from IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, which is a very big umbrella term that says nothing about what the underlying cause is. 11% of the world population is 890 million people.
Yeah.
Hadza, which are one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes. They're eating game animals that they hunt, baobab fruit, which is super high in fiber. They're foraging for wild honey, and they eat wild berries. They've never been on antibiotics. Within the balance of that ecosystem, the bacteria does not cause disease in their body. They don't have diabetes, they don't have obesity, they don't get heart disease, they don't get dementia. And part of what I try to teach patients is to tap into that intuitive wisdom. Very, very important. The signal is there. Just because you don't have any gut symptoms doesn't mean that you don't have a gut-related health issue. Super important for people to know, especially.
Welcome, Vincent. Yeah, thank you, man, for being here. I mean, it's so awesome that we just met each other and now you're here, you know?
Literally like 5 days ago.
That's right.
And
yeah,
here I am on your podcast.
It's amazing, man. The topic that I obviously wanted to talk to you about when you mentioned about gut health, and it was like, wow, this is such an important topic. I definitely want someone to come on this show and shine some light on this topic of gut health. I think it's such a relevant topic for a lot of people, and I think especially in the Western world, because there's so many things that affect gut health that are new, that, let's say, people who live in the jungles of the Amazons, they don't really have those issues. And so it's a very current and important.
They actually have a greater, if you think about it, they have a resiliency, and their gut has the capacity to harbor what would be some pathogenic bacteria that could be harmful to us with our westernized gut that's been exposed to processed foods and too much sugar and antibiotics and all that.
For sure.
And I can speak to this because in 2020, I went to Tanzania. And part of the reason I went there was to stay with the Hadza, which are one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes on the planet.
Cool. Wow.
And what's really fascinating about the Hadza is that they've looked at their gut microbiome. So they did a test. They took stool samples from the Hadza, and they looked at the makeup of their gut microbiome. They used an Italian group control. When you think about it, like Mediterranean diet is one of the healthiest diets on the planet. But they're still westernized, so that doesn't mean that they haven't been exposed to antibiotics and to other processed foods and stuff. Whereas the Hadza are hunter-gatherers.
Right.
So they're eating game animals that they hunt. They eat baobab fruit, which is super high in fiber. They're foraging for wild honey, and they eat when they're having honey, they're eating the honeycomb, they're having the honey, the honeybees. They eat wild berries, and they also eat tubers, which are, when I was there, they were very much kind of like a very water-filled potato, almost like jicama.
Okay.
Kind of like that you can actually bite into it and chew it raw.
Okay. Yeah.
And because of that, and because of the fact that they've never been on antibiotics before, they have an incredibly diverse gut microbiome. And within that diversity, the microbiome responds to what we eat. And the microbiome is also composed of bacteria that we acquire by being exposed to nature, by getting our hands dirty in the dirt, like being exposed to other animals.
Sure.
And so their gut microbiome has certain bacteria like Treponema, which is the bacteria that causes syphilis. And yet in their gut, it's specially designed to basically break down the cellulose fibers in plants. And within the balance of that ecosystem, the bacteria does not cause disease in their body.
Makes sense.
Now, if I took that bacteria and I put it into a westernized person's gut, it would probably cause disease and the person would get very sick. So it's very fascinating to look at that because, you know, we talk about the gut microbiome, which is this incredibly vast group of bacteria, anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 species that live in the large intestine. Primarily, that's the biggest reservoir of bacteria, 100 trillion potential bacteria in our large intestine. And just to put that into perspective, there are 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So we have more bacteria in our gut than there are stars in the night sky that we look at. So there is not just one microbiome. There are many microbiomes, and it's dependent on how you are raised, what foods you eat, what your environment is, what your exposures are, how much hygiene you practice versus allowing yourself to get exposed to nature and dirt and whatnot. So it's a very complex issue. You know, there's not one perfect microbiome for everyone. And they've done studies where they look at the microbiomes, people across the world, and the Asian microbiome is different than the South American microbiome, different from the North American. And so, but what's really fascinating, since you brought up like Amazonians or hunter-gatherer tribes, is that it's almost like a human time capsule. By studying their stool, we can look at like maybe this is how things looked thousands of years ago. And that wouldn't be so important. Maybe it would be just the fascination.
Right.
But the thing is, the reason that it's so like amazing is that they don't have diabetes, they don't have obesity, they don't get heart disease, they don't get dementia. And we know with all the research that is being done now and in the last 20 years, the explosion of research, that the gut microbiome, and as you said, gut health, is tied to every single chronic disease on the planet.
Crazy.
Yeah.
It's a topic that most people overlook. They don't really have much awareness around the gut unless they have issues, unless they start having issues. And I feel like a lot of people probably do. Do you have any kind of like statistics or metrics around how many people, what's the percentage of people having issues with their gut? Like it's probably hard.
I mean, we know that about 11% of the world population suffers from IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, which is a very big umbrella term that says nothing about what the underlying cause is. But 11% of the world population is 890 million people. But behind that, there's a lot of different processes. There can be yeast overgrowth, there can be parasites, there can be imbalances in the gut microbiome. And this is just IBS. And the number of people that take anti-acid medications because they suffer from heartburn or acid reflux, the acid medication industry is the number 2 biggest pharmaceutical drug prescribed worldwide. Billions of prescriptions. So it's hard to say for sure how many people suffer from these conditions. And especially when you start digging into like everything that is gut related. You almost think anybody who has a chronic disease has a gut issue that could be tied to dysbiosis, that could be tied to leaky gut syndrome, so increased intestinal permeability. So the numbers are huge.
Staggering,
They're staggering.
Crazy, So maybe we can start from like, how do one even do a proper test to get a comprehensive analysis of their gut biome? Like what are the steps that people would take?
Let me start by saying that there is not one perfect test for the gut microbiome. And there's a lot of companies out there. We do know that certain bugs are pathogenic and we know the ones that are favorable, but we don't fully yet understand what is the proper balance of that. Like I started saying in the beginning that the microbiome of the Hadza, the hunter-gatherers in East Africa, looks very different than the microbiome of a Western person.
Right.
So if you can get a read on your whole microbiome, the trick in the where the art is still is that it doesn't yet fully translate into if this, then that. It's much more nuanced, and it's a much bigger picture. And I think some people get stuck on these companies saying like, oh, they look at their microbiome and it's going to tell you what vegetables you can eat. And I don't think we're quite there yet.
Okay.
I do feel that we still, I use the testing, and I think stool PCR testing and analyzing the microbiome, the presence of certain bacteria versus others, and seeing if there's certain types of pathogenic bacteria that produce inflammatory substances. I think that's super important. But it's also really important not to forget our own intuitive nature and the self-knowing that there is when you really are connected with your body. You can tell when you're eating something that doesn't agree with you, and you can tell when you eat something that your body is asking for. And part of what I try to teach patients is to tap into that intuitive wisdom, because it's very, very important. And it's almost like when I start working with people, I act as their surrogate, like gut whisperer, to teach them what their bodies are speaking to them, that they're just not listening. The signal is there. They just don't know how to interpret the signal, or they're overriding the signal because they have so much information overload. And sometimes we abdicate our power to a test. But the greatest wisdom is in the body. And that said, like, people need to understand that the testing is not just the microbiome. Like, a really good stool test is going to look at inflammatory markers. And there's some really good inflammatory markers that can tell us a lot about what's happening inside the gut, like calprotectin that's released by neutrophils. And if the calprotectin is high, we know that there is an inflammatory insult happening in the gut, and the body is trying to protect itself from it. But we also want to look at digestive markers. We want to see, are you breaking down meat fibers? Are you breaking down vegetable fibers? Are there digestive inadequacies? Are you having trouble metabolizing or absorbing fats? Are you having imbalances in bile acid metabolites? Is there a high level of secretory IgA, which is an immunoglobulin that is secreted into the gut? And if it's elevated, then we got to figure out, why is it elevated? What is your body trying to fight off? What's going on there? And then we have all these surrogate markers for leaky gut, like anti-zonulin antibodies or anti-actin antibody, actin being a microfilament, which is part of the tight junction that holds our intestinal cells together. And if you develop antibodies to that, that's considered a surrogate marker for leaky gut, because we shouldn't be exposed to these proteins, and our body should not be creating antibodies to our own proteins. But the story is bigger than just the test, because the story is the health journey of the person and the symptoms that they're having. And just because you don't have any gut symptoms doesn't mean that you don't have a gut-related health issue. And that's super important for people to know, especially, some of the red flags are you have autoimmune disease. If you have autoimmune disease, you've got gut imbalances. Even if you think that you poop fine, everything looks good, there's something going on in your gut. And I've had those patients where they were lighting up all across the board, whole bunch of autoimmune antibodies. They're being diagnosed with all sorts of conditions, potentially lupus and whatnot. And the way I look at things is that I think that sometimes the diagnosis is misleading, because it's giving the patient a false sense of security that we figured out what's going on, but we haven't. Because what we really need to understand is, why is your immune system suddenly attacking self?
Right, right.
Why is it dysregulated? Your immune system shouldn't do that. And really what could be behind it is leaky gut, dysbiosis, which is an imbalance in the gut microbiome. I've seen parasites, I've seen yeast overgrowth being the drivers of this in a person that had zero gut symptoms.
Yeah.
Normal poops, no symptoms. So if you're out there and you're listening to this and you think like, well, my gut is fine, but I went to the doctor and I've been told that I have these autoimmune markers. I feel tired. I feel achy. My muscles get tired. I don't recover from workouts well. I get joint aches. Even if you have no gut symptoms, you probably have a gut issue. And that needs to be investigated. And that's where the testing comes in. And that's where the stool PCR, looking at different markers, seeing if there are yeast overgrowth, parasites, all those things. Because then the healing process for this patient that came in with lighting up with all these autoimmune markers was actually determining that she was sensitive to gluten as well as dairy.
Yep.
And finding that she had yeast overgrowth, and she also had a parasite that is a very common worldwide parasite called Blastocystis hominis. And treating these underlying issues made all of her symptoms disappear. Her energy came back, joint pains resolved. And of course, you know, in medicine, we always rule out all other potential causes, because when you have fatigue, joint pains, muscle aches, and joint aches, those are very general symptoms.
Yeah.
The list of things that could be causing those symptoms is quite broad. The problem in Western medicine is that the thing that's never on that list is dysbiosis, leaky gut, parasites, yeast overgrowth, other gut imbalances. And that's where we need to shift the conversation, because what they were going to do with this patient is put her on immunosuppressives and the new biologics. And instead, she had the intuition and desire to do things naturally. And we were able to improve her health within a couple of months. Just by using a very different approach that, instead of trying to label a condition, is looking at the true underlying mechanisms and drivers of why her immune system has gone awry. And I think that's the way we need to shift the paradigm.
Totally. Wow. Yeah, there's so much to it sounds like there's so much that we still don't know how to really assess. There's so many biomarkers, variables. We don't really know the cause and effect, like how to interpret the data. But I'm sure there are best practices in prevention, like the food that you eat, the type of life that you have. What would you have are the main pillars of a healthy lifestyle, healthy gut, like to maintain healthy gut? What do you need to do?
It's going to be all the things that you've probably heard many times before.
Yeah.
It's having a healthy diet, which can mean different things for different people, but really eating as close to the earth as possible, things that either saw the sun, were raised by the sun, or ate things that were supported by the sun, so plants. And if you are eating animals that were raised without antibiotics, that were grass-fed, then the next part is movement. Movement is very important. And then the third pillar is stress management. Super important. And I think it's the one that is, I would say that a lot of people put major emphasis on diet, and reasonably so, because diet is challenging for people. You know, even people who think that they are eating healthy, a lot of times they're not eating healthy for their body. And I see a lot of patients that come to me who are, if you put on paper what they're eating, it sounds like they're eating super healthy. And yet a lot of times people come to me with severe bloating. They feel sick to their stomach all their time. They're having either constipation or diarrhea. And yet they're eating what seems to be, quote unquote, a healthy diet. but it's not healthy for them. And that makes it super confusing. So that part can be difficult for people to figure out. But a lot of times people only focus on that, like what to eat, what supplements to take, and then they forget about the movement piece, like whatever that means, like exercise, yoga, Pilates, working out, running, cardio, like that is really important for gut health. And I've seen it especially with my women patients, that if they are not moving, then they become more constipated. Movement is key, super key. And then the third piece, the stress aspect, is the one that most people completely neglect. They don't even think like, oh, well, this is like the cherry on top. Maybe I'll get to it. And they think that, well, if I'm doing the diet right and I'm exercising, then I don't need to manage my stress. But the thing is, the stress and the stress response, the vagus nerve, play such a huge role in our health that if you neglect that piece, you're always going to be hitting a plateau. You're going to be hitting a wall. And you want to be here, but you just can't get there. And then you don't see what is it that's missing. It's mindfulness practices, it's breath work, it's nervous system regulation. And that's one huge piece. I mean, I've been doing this now. I've been a doctor for over 20 years, and in gut health itself as a functional medicine expert for 17 years. And the longer I've been in medicine and practicing medicine, the more I've realized that nervous system regulation and regulating the vagal response, which gets us into the more relaxed state. And we can go in I can go deep and dive into more about that. The more we regulate that, the more you can get your body into a more relaxed state, the easier the healing is. You cannot heal a stressed out body.
And does it also work kind of the other way, where your gut health can affect your levels of depression and anxiety? Can you speak
Absolutely.
to that?
It's a two-way street, and they go in both directions. We know that there are more vagal fibers pointing up to the brain from the periphery, from the gut. Like 70 to 80% of the nerve fibers from the vagus actually fire up to the brain from the gut. And only about 30% are firing down. Now, both pathways are super important. The pathways that are going up to the brain are actually regulating things like brain activation, like the release of glutamine. So they affect depression, anxiety, all of those things that we call mental health disorders, which actually have a strong tie, not the whole piece of the puzzle, but part of the puzzle is gut health. And I've seen this with patients, even like a bipolar patient on medications, that still, even on medications with cycling up and down between depression and mania, when they heal their gut and work on their gut health, the cycling dampened and they actually become more responsive to the medications.
Oh, yeah. And when you were talking about, not every diet is for, like, any healthy diet would work for any type of person. Is it based on maybe their background, where they were grew up? Is that the main influence? Or let's say if two humans or two kids of the same family grew up in the same environment, would they have a very similar biome in their... Or how does that work exactly?
Not necessarily, although there can be a lot of convergence in the microbiome, especially within a household. But still, it's going to depend on their activity. Maybe one child likes to eat sweets a lot, and maybe the other child is into sports and prefers to eat healthy and it's always exercising. And we know from studies done in the University College Cork in Ireland that there are some sort of effect that's happening from exercise that it improves the makeup of the gut microbiome. You know, maybe it's the stress regulation, maybe it's the balancing of hormones, the endorphin release, the dopamine, Maybe those are factors. Maybe also people who exercise tend to eat healthier. Or their bodies process their nutrients better without causing blood sugar spikes and whatnot. So there's a lot of different influences. But in reference to the patient who comes in and they're quote unquote eating healthy, but their body is behaving as if they're not, a lot of it has to do with an imbalance in their gut microbiome that was triggered by a whole series of events. Who knows? There could have been a stressful event. A lot of times I've seen gut issues start from a very stressful event, like the loss of a parent, going through a divorce, the loss of a spouse. Something like that can become the trigger for major gut issues. There's always a trigger. And that creates an imbalance. And suddenly the diet that you used to eat and didn't cause bloating, didn't cause any problems, now that same diet does not work. And the only way to heal in those circumstances is you've got to go in and you have to tweak the diet and you have to change some of the eating patterns so you can create a more healing environment in the gut. And eventually you start hopefully going back to the broader diet again.
I see. And when you have, let's say you have a partner or you, let's say, started dating someone or something like that, and now you're sharing saliva. How does that impact your...
I mean, when you kiss a person, you basically exchange like 50,000 bacteria in a kiss.
So how does that influence? Is it a major contributor?
So there's got to be some sort of contribution from that. There was a study done where they looked at what happens to a partner when one gets sick and takes a Z-Pack. And the other one doesn't take the Z-Pack. But they found that there were alterations in their gut microbiome, not to the same extent, but almost as if they had taken an antibiotic.
Crazy.
And they did not. Then they thought, well, is this because they're partners and they're kissing and they're sleeping in the same bed? So then they looked at, well, what happens if it's just two roommates that are not romantically involved and one is given an antibiotic for an infection and the other one doesn't take it? And they found that there was also an effect.
No way. Why? So through what?
And don't know.
Wow. Through
still conjecture, like, maybe there's still some element of shared microbiomes through cups and utensils and things like that. That's part of the theory of, these multi-generational households in the blue zones, where we see people living into their hundreds, and usually there's a lot of community. The grandparent is living with the child, with their grandchildren, and there's some cross-pollination of the microbiome. And so the older person is getting exposed to the younger microbiome, the younger, healthier microbiome of their grandkids. And maybe that's another factor in what we see in longevity in the blue zones. We do know that they've looked at the gut microbiome in centenarians to see like what is different about them. Why is there a different microbiome if you live to 100 versus if you live to 80 and you've had a heart attack and you have diabetes and you're taking all these medications? And what they found was that centenarians have a microbiome that actually fights inflammation, that actually has the ability to reduce inflammation. Whereas in comparison, someone who's 80-year-old with a bunch of chronic health issues has a very inflammatory gut microbiome.
Wow, that makes sense. And that would lead to so in the Western world where people live kind of separated in little cages and little homes, that's also probably influencing us not sharing, not having enough, a bigger pool of bacteria being shared like that.
I think a lot of factors there, including the over-sanitization, the using of, we've shown in studies that using antibacterial hand soap actually affects the gut microbiome. So every surface in the body, not just oral, like our skin, absorbs things and then it gets secreted into the gut through the bile from the gallbladder. So even using an antibacterial hand soap, which is, by the way, not required for the most part, is going to affect the makeup of the gut microbiome.
Wow.
So, and then that along with lack of exposure to nature, most people are living in cities, live in apartments, you try to keep everything clean, you're not getting exposed to dirt, to the natural world.
Yep.
All these things are de-diversifying the microbiome. So by and large, I do a lot of stool testing on patients, and one of the things that I find across the board is a loss of diversity of the gut microbiome. And what that word means is what you would think, like diversity is like a rainbow, like a lot of different bacteria living inside the gut. Everybody has anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 species of bacteria living in the large intestine. And within that, there's going to be like 10 to 15% that are pathogenic or less favorable bacteria. But if you think about it, just like the Amazon rainforest has panthers, which are predators, but if you took the predator out of the rainforest, you would create a whole domino effect
that kind of disbalance of kind
imbalances the ecosystem. They did this in Yellowstone. They tried to reduce the population of wolves, and they found that it completely imbalanced the ecosystem, and they had to reintroduce them.
Right.
So in the same way, there's some role, maybe it's a hormetic stressor, like the way that we're doing cold plunging and getting exposed to heat and all that, that those bad bacteria actually keep our good bacteria primed and doing their work best they can to keep things in balance. And it's part of the ecosystem to have a little bit of the bad guys in there, because it keeps things more optimal.
Sure. Very interesting. How many recorded types of bacteria, internal bacteria? You said 1,000, 2,000 in one body, but throughout the whole humankind, how many are there? Hundreds of
probably around that. Yeah. But I mean, if you think about in humans themselves, with variations between regions of the world, because the microbiome shifts slightly depending on the region, and also very much influenced by the types of foods that people eat. Some certain regions are going to eat certain types of foods more than others.
And so let's say you have a method to accurately measure the makeup of the types of bacteria and identify, you live in this environment and this this is the most optimal configuration. Let's assume we got to the point where we now know how to do that. Will there be maybe the way to balance it? Just can you eat, I don't know, how can you consume some additional ones to overbalance it? Just give you extra little bacteria of this kind or of that kind?
That's by and large what I find with people. And not everyone can tolerate fermented foods or probiotic-rich foods. Because depending on what's happening in their gut, there's a right time for everything. But what I'm finding is that the best way to diversify the gut microbiome is not necessarily through probiotics, although I use probiotics a lot because they can provide targeted therapies that help to start to alter the ecosystem and help heal the internal ecosystem. But ultimately, my goal is to get people to have fermented foods. And most ideally, if I can get them to make some of those at home, because a homemade sauerkraut or homemade kefir is going to be way richer in probiotic bacteria than anything that you buy.
Because of the preservatives or what? Or
just because of the process, and just because when you make something at home, you have greater control over the fermentation period. So you're just going to get much higher numbers of bacteria. Whereas commercially, they're controlling the process and they're trying to speed up the production time. So you're not getting the same quality as you would if you're making something that's homemade.
And shine some light on antibiotic treatment. in what cases that is something that we really should be considering, and in what cases that's definitely harmful. I would imagine it's harmful no matter what, but well, tell me a little bit more about that.
I mean, antibiotics are both very helpful and are life-saving. I've kept patients out of the hospital by catching an infection just in time and putting them on an antibiotic to treat that infection, whether it was a pneumonia or a kidney infection, and kept them out of the hospital. So antibiotics can be certainly life-saving, but they come with a price. And they always come with a price. There is no antibiotic that doesn't come with a price. Some of them come with higher prices. Some of them come with less cost to our health. But all of them come with a price. Even the one that everybody takes for colds, the Z-Pak. And I certainly sometimes prescribe it to patients. And interesting, because Z-Paks are both antimicrobial, but also do amplify our antiviral interferon production. So they somehow have a slight antiviral effect.
Yeah.
But one 5-day Z-Pak is going to take your gut 6 months to recover from.
Wow.
So every time you take an antibiotic, there is an internal price that's being paid. But antibiotics are sometimes very necessary, and antimicrobials, especially when dealing with gut infections, pathogenic bacteria like E. coli or Salmonella or Shigella, there's sometimes no other way to treat it other than with an antibiotic. Or even like antifungals for yeast overgrowth, candida. Sometimes the herbals are not strong enough, and I find that you have to use a prescription antifungal in order to help get the person past the sticking point.
Right.
Or if a person has a parasite, I'm not a patient person. So if I personally have a parasite, I want to treat it in the most rapidly and most effective way to heal the body. And so the antiparasitic medications are highly effective for that.
Yeah.
You know, so there are time and place for these things. The difference is that when I put a patient on an antibiotic, I'm already thinking about how am I going to protect their gut? How am I going to protect the gut microbiome, their gut lining? And how am I going to restore the gut after they're done with the antibiotic dose? And the true fact is that most people have already been on multiple rounds of antibiotics.
Right.
Even by the time they see me.
Mm-hmm.
And every time we're on a round of antibiotics, it's like you're chipping away at your gut microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
There's a theory that the gut microbiome doesn't fully recover to where it's from. But I do believe that it's possible to recover with like following a lot of the things that I've talked about in my books, Happy Gut and the Gut Smart Protocol.
Mm-hmm.
You can heal your gut,
and
you can create a certain level of rebalancing of the ecosystem by becoming really conscious about how you eat, what you put into your body, how you manage stress in your life. And I can say that because I was on 20 plus rounds of antibiotics between the age of 10 and the age of 19.
Wow.
I was overprescribed antibiotics, which is at least the CDC has determined that 30 to 40% of antibiotic prescriptions are not necessary.
Yeah.
But we are being overprescribed antibiotics a lot of times for what is a viral infection that doesn't necessarily require
for sure
an antibiotic. That said, sometimes you do need an antibiotic.
Yeah. How can one do their own due diligence, not knowing really, if they're being prescribed antibiotics, how can one at least, is this second opinion? Is that what it is? Or is there other way you can do it?
The truth is, if you're being prescribed an antibiotic, you're not going to want to waste time, getting an appointment for another doctor that might take another week to get to, but you have to be an empowered patient. Mm-hmm. And one way that you can be an empowered patient is to ask your doctor, is this antibiotic really necessary?
Yeah.
Not just taking the prescription and trusting the doctor,
right,
but challenge the doctor with this one question. Is this antibiotic really necessary? Do you really think I have a bacterial infection? And at least it makes the doctor think, and you can watch the doctor's response and then decide, because the thing is, I've been on the other side of the table.
Yeah.
I trained as a Western doctor before I trained in functional medicine and more holistic medicine. So I understand the thinking process, and I also understand the pharmaceutical-driven medicine that doctors have been indoctrinated under.
Yeah.
And also put that into a healthcare system that encourages 15-minute visits. So when the doctor walks into the room, they're trying to figure out, what do I need to do for this person as quickly as possible so I can help them, but I can also move them so I can get to the next patient.
Right.
And there's this feeling that in order for a patient to be satisfied, you have to have written a prescription. So what if you go to your doctor and your doctor tells you, well, there's nothing to do. You just have a viral infection. You just have to let it, run its course. The patient feels like they feel like they weren't given anything. So the philosophy behind the therapeutic relationship is partly being powered by the patient, and patient thinking, well, I'm going to the doctor, they should give me something to help me, and then to be told like, oh, it's just a virus. Now, when I work with patients, I empower them. I say, look, this is a virus, but these are the things we can do. We can use antiviral herbs. We're going to boost your immune system. We're going to take dairy out of your diet because that's going to create more mucus, and that's going to make this infection last longer. And we're going to give you medicinal mushrooms to activate your natural killer cells. So there's a whole other way to look at it. And it's not just attacking something, but it's how do we build up the body so that it can handle that infection, and also understand if someone gets recurrent infections, like what is the underlying issue? Are there gut health issues? Are there other things that are not being addressed that are inhibiting the immune response? But the question to ask is, do I really need this antibiotic?
Yeah, and if they're hesitating, they have to tell you the truth, right? Like they can't be like lying to you. One thing that I noticed, so depending on where you are in the world, let's say I'm from Belarus, so Soviet Union, and I know that, let's say, dairy is definitely a lot more common, and a lot less. It causes a lot less issues there than it is here. So it's not just say dairy is not good for us. Maybe dairy in the Western world, is it even dairy, or maybe it's dairy plus something else that's bad for us. And same with gluten and other things that recommended not to. It's
the entire picture of the person. But, if you think about dairy in the United States, I don't know about, you can let me know about Belarus. It's homogenized, it's pasteurized, it's being removed of all of its nutrient power, all the enzymes that are found in raw dairy. And that makes it a highly antigenic substance that a lot of people, especially if they have leaky gut, can develop sensitivities or immune reactions to the whey proteins as well as the casein proteins in dairy. But dairy is also very mucus promoting, creates mucus in the system. So regardless, if somebody has a cold or has a lot of congestion or has a lot of mucus, tends to sinus infections, we can actually do specific blood sensitivity testing to see if the person reacts to a whole host of different dairy proteins. So we can be scientific about it, because I like to be data-driven, but I also have 20 plus years of experience. So I know that if a person has an upper respiratory infection, has a cough, has a lot of mucus, you want to take dairy out. Doesn't mean that dairy has to stay out of the diet, but dairy needs to stay out so that the person can heal, in that moment in time.
Yeah, because like even sometimes you know you go to Europe and you eat bread and you have no response whatsoever in Italy, for example, right? Pasta or something like that, and then here it's a completely different story. You can't have that.
It's a different wheat. So part of it is they're using einkorn wheat or more ancient wheat. And the ancient wheat is not as high in gluten content as the dwarf wheat that has been hybridized in the United States, where it's 30 to 50% more gluten content. And our enzymes don't have the power to break down that much gluten. We know that gluten is capable of unlocking gut permeability so that it actually increases gut permeability. So even for someone who is not gluten sensitive, gluten is having some effect on the gut. And if you magnify that with exposure over years and years and years, eventually that can lead to disease.
Right.
But I also like to be data driven. So with that, I run a gluten panel and I look at a reaction to a whole bunch of different gliadin molecules and different gluten breakdown products. And also something that people might not know, because we talk so much about gluten, that there are non-gluten wheat proteins that some people also react to. So not everybody has a gluten problem. Some of them are actually reacting to other proteins in wheat. And again, the problem is stemming from exposure to antibiotics, exposure to pesticides, exposure to processed foods, too much sugar, imbalances in the gut microbiome that are the first domino that then tips the next domino, which is gut permeability. So we lose the integrity of the gut barrier, and then that allows for more inflammatory substances, as well as partially digested proteins to get into the body. So the body sees something that it should not see. The body should only be seeing the breakdown products of our food, which for proteins are amino acids. But if the gut is more permeable and the holes, so the connections between the cells in the gut, instead of being tight like this where you can't see through them, they develop little holes. And through those holes, you can have partially digested proteins, like chains of amino acids that get into the body. And on the other side of that is kind of like the neutral zone, and it's patrolled by our white blood cells, the gut being the biggest presence of our immune system. It's command central for the immune system. About 80% of our immune system is all along the gut lining. And part of what our immune cells do is they have these dendritic cells that are basically just patrolling that area, and they're looking to see if any foreign substances come in. And if they do, they think, oh, it's an invader, it's a bacteria.
Right.
But it actually might just be a food particle that's now being confused for a bacteria. And the body says, well, this is foreign. Set up a whole immune response, start producing antibodies. And that's where these things just cascade themselves.
Wow, yeah, I can see that for sure. Wow, that's insightful. It's very insightful. I was going to ask, what is the effect of coffee on your gut? Is coffee healthy?
With caveats.
Yeah.
Right? Because what a lot of people don't know or don't recognize or even think about when they're going to get their coffee is that coffee is one of the top 10 most pesticide sprayed crops on the planet. And those pesticides have neurotoxins, they have agents that act as antimicrobials, so they will mess up the gut microbiome, leading to the same thing. I just said the first domino that tips is an imbalance in the gut microbiome, and that leads to leaky gut. Then once you have leaky gut, the next domino is inflammation. And when you have inflammation, then you get insulin resistance. That means you start having blood sugar metabolism issues. Your blood sugar rises, and then you gain weight. You develop prediabetes. You can't lose weight. You start developing more fat in the middle. So it's important to recognize that the micro habits that we do every day can have a really significant impact on our health. Now, that said, coffee is rich in polyphenols. Polyphenols are antioxidant molecules produced by plants as a way to protect themselves, and these polyphenols actually feed our gut microbiome. And as a result, the gut microbiome breaks down those polyphenols into tiny little antioxidants that then can be absorbed into the body or even trigger the release of different hormones like GLP-1. So we know that polyphenols from coffee help trigger GLP-1 release, which is a satiety hormone that helps you feel full so you avoid overeating. So coffee has the polyphenols, the caffeine, the gut-brain connection. They find a lot of benefits with coffee with patients with Parkinson's disease, with dementia, and also the way it stimulates gut motility. So for a lot of people, it actually, and especially women who tend more towards constipation, coffee can help with that. You just have to be really cognizant of the hidden dangers in coffee, which could be pesticides, could be mold mycotoxins, and could even be heavy metals.
So you're saying the source of the coffee is like super crucial when you're a coffee drinker. You always have to really look at where it's coming from.
You have to think about all these things, and you also have to think about your coffee habit. Like, how do you consume your coffee on a daily basis? You know, are you using a K-cup every day? And did you think about the fact that that K-cup is lined with plastic? And sure, it makes your life convenient. It's so easy. You just pop the K-cup in, you press the button, the hot water comes through, and then you've got your cup of coffee in a minute or a minute and a half.
Right.
But in that coffee, now that hot water, that pressurized hot water has gone through a K-cup that's lined with plastic, and now you're also drinking plastic with your coffee, microplastics, which studies are showing cause disruptions in the gut microbiome, destroy the mucus layer of the gut, and lead to leaky gut and inflammation and all the things that we're trying to avoid, because those are the underlying drivers of chronic disease in our country. So it's important not just like to understand how our micro habits are influencing our macro health.
Yeah, I know that you speak a lot about the plastics, and it's close to impossible to avoid microplastics in the Western world, right?
It's scary.
Yeah,
it's actually scary, and you know, I speak a lot about it. But yet I still go to the supermarket, and you have no choice, because even if you're buying organic blueberries, they're in a plastic container. You know, or things are plastic wrapped. There are certain things that you can do to avoid excessive exposure to microplastics, which is really what we should be doing. You want to try to minimize how much of that comes into your body, because it's doing things like scrambling your hormones. It's messing up your hormone balance. It's causing greater exposure to xenoestrogens, so endocrine disrupting chemicals that are high. They stimulate the estrogen receptors. So then you wonder, you know, why are there increasing rates of breast cancer and just a lot of estrogen dominance in women, and infertility, and women going into perimenopause earlier in age. And you have to look at our environment as a factor. But one thing that you can do is carry a coffee tumbler to the coffee shop that is deal lined, and ask them to make your coffee in your own to-go coffee tumbler, because those to-go cups are lined with plastic. And then on top of that, become aware of like how you're consuming your coffee, what type of coffee it is. Is it organic? Is it free of mold? All those things. Don't drink out of plastic water bottles. Like, carry your own. I always travel. I have a travel water bottle that's with me on my travel backpack that I will fill at the airport. And if they have the filtered water fountains, I'll fill it with the filtered water, and try to avoid plastic that way as well.
Makes sense.
You know, you even have to think about plastic in clothes, like polyester made clothes, like synthetic fabrics have plastic in them.
So, yeah, it's like you're walking on a minefield. Everything you have to be, you can kind of go crazy it's basically you have to constantly scan and overthink, and
And I think us as a human race, the population on this planet. The United Nations actually recently was trying to pass a resolution that was being led by Rwanda to actually require more recycling of plastics, because I don't know if you know this, but only 30% of plastic is recycled.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is it's cheaper to make new plastic than to recycle plastic. And actually, the UN resolution had a lot of resistance, because you can imagine there's a lot of influence from the petroleum industry, because plastic comes from petroleum. So what we can control is our own buying behavior. You know, and if you go to farmers markets, you'll find vegetables that are not wrapped in plastic. And you can go with your fabric bag and just put the vegetables into your fabric bag and never have them touch plastic. It really, like, you know, I mean, in the winter, we have no choice, right? Especially up north, things are going to be packaged. It really irks me to buy an English cucumber that comes like sealed in a plastic. And it just makes you wonder, like, is this healthy? Like, you know, I'm eating a healthy vegetable, but it came wrapped in plastic. Like, is that okay?
Right. It's like the entire surface of it is touching the plastic, and it's who knows how long it's been doing that for certain, like, And
the thing is with plastic, it's the temperature changes, whether too cold or too hot, especially like exposure to heat, is going to allow for leaching of those plastics into like a liquid. Like, you know, so many things are now in plastic water bottles.
And what about raw fish and sushi or ceviche or even smoked salmon? I know it's considered raw fish, basically. What would you say to those? Can we eat those? Yeah.
You're always taking a little bit of a risk. I mean, the FDA actually requires that sushi grade fish is frozen first, then thawed, and the freezing process will kill off a lot of potential parasites in there. Because if you are getting it fresh, like if you go to have you been to Tokyo?
No, I haven't.
So there's a market in Tokyo where it's a fish market, and basically you have a giant tuna and they're slicing it right there, and you can eat it raw, right from like freshly caught. I mean, you're taking a risk. But the question is, you know, like, part of the problem is our guts are already messed up, and they can't handle exposure to parasites and such. If you look at India in the last half century, what you see is a westernization of India, like the rise in the use of antibiotics. And with that, we are seeing a rise in autoimmune disease that didn't exist in India. Now, India also had a bigger parasite burden in their guts. And somehow, maybe that parasite burden, it tends to regulate the immune system and keep the immune system from being overactive. So you see this evolution if you look at the plot of the autoimmune disease in India, how it's increased since the 1950s. And you wonder, like, you know, with colonization, like the introduction of sugar, refined flour, but then antibiotics, it's really changed the eating patterns and also the behavior of how people treat their health. And that's causing this explosion of autoimmune disease in a country that used to not have.
How would you describe the ideal? So maybe the future, let's say we figured out how to live healthy future life. I mean, yes, maybe we are technologically advanced beings and we have all of the science and technology, but at the same time, we do want to incorporate the practices that have served us for millions of years. What is your version of the desirable future that is all encompassing health? There's a lot of practices that we incorporated. Describe to me that vision that you might have around that.
One important thing is to realize that we are biological beings.
Yes.
And biological beings have a rhythm. They have an ebb and a flow. We're not an iPhone. We're not an iPad that can just go and go and go and go until the battery dies.
Right.
But as long as the battery is charged, it can go at the same speed. Well, maybe after a while, you know, like especially PCs, they start getting bogged down. But you know what I mean? We're not computers.
Yeah.
We're not technology. And yet, I think a lot of people are confusing that. And they think that their body should behave like their technology, and that it shouldn't have an ebb and flow. You know, so this past week I had a patient who has ADD, and he went to a psychiatrist, and he's having some issues with concentration. And so the psychiatrist wanted to not only increase the medication, but also make it twice a day, because they were feeling that they weren't being as productive.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, what is your definition of productivity?
Right.
Do you think that you're supposed to be productive for 5 hours straight with no breaks? No brain moment for your brain to breathe?
Yeah.
Like, we are biological beings. And I think with the rise of technology, what's matched it is like this, like philosophy that we have to match the technology. And you see people working like 12-hour days, 16-hour days, and trading desks, looking at the computer screens all day. And then what you see 10 years down the line is a burnt out person that has no energy, that is depressed, that is not happy with their lives. And it's because they forgot that we are biological beings.
Yeah.
That we've got an ebb and flow, and you've got to reflect, or you've got to not reflect, you've got to respect that your body is not a computer. And in order to optimize the way your body behaves, it needs breaks. It needs time out in nature. It needs exercise. It needs eating the right foods. It needs community.
Yeah.
You know, we need a lot of things that our technology doesn't need in order to run. And as we become more and more technologically advanced, we can't forget that we are human. And that being human is very different than being a piece of technology.
Being like a machine or a robot. Yeah. Do you see us going back to living like more integrated in nature, like tribal type living? Or do you think it's probably hard to do at the scale of like how many humans we have? We just have to kind of figure out how to work with what we have type thing.
I think we have to figure out how to work with what we have. I mean, we're not going to turn the clock back on where civilization has advanced and how most people live in cities, although you can choose to live out in the country. And thankfully, there are still places on the earth where you can escape humanity. And I think that's super healthy. I think it's recognizing that even if you live in a city, you need to have some level of balance there where you get out into nature, where you leave the city, where you go to a place where there are less people. Maybe you go to the mountains, maybe you go to the beach, somewhere where you can ground and earth yourself. Yeah. And by doing that, you regulate your nervous system. So I think people don't realize it's such a big topic, like, you know, getting into EMFs and Wi-Fi signals and just the energy that we pick up from being concentrated quarters with others in cities. It needs to be balanced.
Yeah, the way I understand it, so our body is capable of, so let's say the sun produces radiation, and radiation is basically kind of like bullets. Particles just fly through you and they knock off some protons, electrons off matter, and your cells get corrupted in a way. And our body has capability of restoring at a certain pace. But once you bombard it with more radiation, you'll die basically. And so us having more like Wi-Fi and other radio signals really stressing our body to being able to replicate cells at a certain rate, I guess. And that's kind of how is that the right kind of
and also with the foundation, because our cells are built to react to and neutralize what we're calling free radicals, which are generated by radiation or by oxidative stress on the cell. And if you're not eating a diet that gives your body the foundation so that you have the right amount of micronutrients, the vitamins, the antioxidants your body can use to neutralize those oxidative forces, then your cells are going to age.
Yeah.
Right? One of the big ones is melatonin. You might not know this, but melatonin is probably the most powerful antioxidant molecule produced in the body. And melatonin is not just produced for sleep by the brain, by the pineal gland. Melatonin is produced in every cell in the body by mitochondria, because melatonin is needed in order to neutralize the very oxidative function of the mitochondria. So melatonin is super important, and they're calculated that 400 times more melatonin is produced in the gut than in the brain, and partly by the gut microbiome, and it's serving a whole different purpose. And if you are not getting the right levels of sleep, if your gut microbiome isn't balanced, it turns out that if you expose yourself to early morning sunlight, that you're helping to regulate your melatonin, as well as your circadian rhythm. And melatonin plays a very key role, even as just activating the immune response.
Let me see, what time is it? Oh yeah, wow. We're
what time are we at?
It's 2:40 now. Yeah, I have.
Wow.
We've done it. Yeah, so I think maybe that's a good place for us to start kind of wrapping the conversation. I'll give you a few moments to share any last thoughts, maybe point people to any resources, your books, places for them to check out. Any last thoughts here? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think when people ask me, like, how do you best restore your gut? And it doesn't matter if you're eating like all the vegetables in the world, like, yeah, you're getting a lot of prebiotic fibers. But what we've seen is that, and I think where the research is showing, and we saw this in a study done by Stanford University, is that fermented foods are the pathway to restoring that diversity in the gut. And that's what I'm seeing in my practice. The question is, how do you incorporate fermented foods? Because some people are so sensitive that even a little bit is going to make them bloated. It's going to make them not feel great. So you have to take baby steps.
Yeah.
But the goal eventually is to have fermented foods as part of our diet, especially as an antidote to all the insults to the diversity of our gut microbiome that happen in the Western world from exposure to pesticides, antibiotics, processed foods, all of that. So if there's one little key tidbit to take from today, it's to work on increasing your intake of fermented foods. If you can, not everyone can, and they require the guidance of the functional medicine practitioner, as myself, to be able to phase them in or to be able to work through the gut imbalances that are making it difficult to have fermented foods. But eventually, that's the way to increase gut diversity the best way. And the reason that you want that is because diversity, to me, is the holy grail of health. The Stanford study showed that by increasing diversity, everyone dropped 19 different inflammatory markers that were being tested, both blood markers and cellular markers of inflammation. they all dropped when microbiome diversity improved.
Well, yeah.
So diversity is like the holy grail of health. And where people can learn more about my work and what I've done, my latest book is the Gut Smart Protocol, which came out last year. It's a 14-day personalized gut healing plan based on a quiz that I devised that's meant for people not just with gut health issues, but also meant to tease out people who might have a gut-related health issue who don't think they do.
Right.
So that's a really great place. I've also come out with a gut-friendly coffee. It's called Happy Gut Coffee, and people can check it out by going to happygutcoffee.com.
Very cool.
That's a USDA organic, toxin-free, mold-free coffee that is low-acid, dark French roast. So it makes it super gut-friendly and great for people who suffer from acid reflux, heartburn, who love coffee but hate how it makes them feel. My coffee is sourced from small organic farmers in South America and then micro-roasted in the lower Hudson Valley to just the perfect level of dark roasting that gives it that flavor complexity, augments the antioxidants, but it's never burnt like some of the commercial brands out there, which then increases a lot of the potential negative health impacts of coffee. And then, of course, on Instagram, at Dr. Pedre, DRPEDRE, I try to post a lot of free information, or they can find links to my blog posts through my Instagram. I like to put out information that educates, informs, and elevates people and inspires them to live healthier lives through the perspective of gut health. And, people can also work directly with me. I take only very select clients. They can check out PedreMD, PedreMD.com. And there's a way to apply to be a patient there if anyone who's listening and would like to work on biohacking their gut health or even just health optimization. That's what I do with people.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you, Vincent. Yeah, this was great. Very informative, eye-opening conversation. I look definitely inspired to have more guests like yourself. And for anyone who is still around, still listening, thank you for staying all the way till the end. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. And I'll see you on the next one. Thank you. Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers, man. Yeah, amazing. Thank you. And this is how it goes. Wow, the time just flew, kind of.